Let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly wild case involving a scholar named Dr. Chen Jingyan who found himself staring down the barrel of a very severe criminal charge. And his response? He composed a staggering 20,000-word defense. But you have to understand, this wasn't your standard legal plea begging for leniency. Instead, he launched what can really only be described as a multidisciplinary strike. He actually pulled from physics, psychology, and complex systems theory to logically deconstruct the entire case against him, piece by piece. Here is our roadmap for exploring this case layer by layer, viewing the exact same event through highly distinct academic disciplines. First, the setup and catalyst. Second, we'll look at the physics of network dynamics. Third, jurisprudence, focusing on legal and logical voids. Fourth, cognition and system collision. And finally, humanism and spiritual breakout. So let's start with a rather provocative question. Can a mathematical formula literally disprove a criminal charge? Seriously, just imagine for a second facing real prison time for a retweet that almost no one even saw. That was Dr. Chen's reality. His defense forces to ask what happens when the rigid, often highly subjective framework of the law crashes headfirst into the cold, unbending rules of mathematics and physics.
Part 1. The setup and catalyst. Dr. Chen faced charges under a very broad legal category, but his method of defense was entirely unprecedented.
He was actually indicted for picking quarrels and provoking trouble. Now, normally, that's a charge you'd expect to see used for someone literally starting a physical riot in a public square or maybe throwing bricks through windows. Yet here, it was applied to a few retweets on a digital timeline that had almost zero engagement. The core accusation was that his retweets caused serious public disorder. But wait a minute, how exactly do you prove a digital riot happened when literally no one even showed up to the protest? That's the bizarre reality we're dealing with here.
Moving on to Part 2, Physics and Network Dynamics. Instead of just arguing legal precedent, Dr. Chen used statistical physics to mathematically disprove the prosecution's claims. He brought in this concept of a scale-free network. In physics, this is a network where the distribution of node connections follows a power law, which basically creates extreme asymmetry. To put that in plain English, social media platforms operate exactly like scale-free networks. They're like a universe made up of a few massive, Jupiter-sized planets and then just countless microscopic specks of dust. Why? Because algorithms reward the big players, aggressively pushing their content while completely burying the small ones. It's a system literally designed for inequality, where a tiny fraction of users commands almost all the attention.
Imagine official media and those mega influencers as these massive hub nodes. They have the gravity to pull in millions of eyes with just a single post. Dr. Chen, however, is what you call a peripheral node. He had nearly zero followers. Because he's a peripheral node, mathematically, he exists in what physicists call a subcritical state. He acts like a tiny spark floating in a vacuum with absolutely zero oxygen. Even if he wanted to start a blazing fire, it's physically impossible. A retweet from an account like his simply cannot cause a cascading avalanche of information, no matter what the content actually says. And we have the math to back this up. Physicist Reuven Cohen's formula gives us a hard mathematical threshold, represented simply by the number 1, for a scale-free network to collapse. The physics proves that for a network to completely break down or experience severe disorder, you would basically have to take out almost all the highly connected nodes, those massive planets we just talked about. The energy required for Dr. Chen's zero-engagement retweets to cause a system-wide collapse just does not exist. It falls wildly short of the mathematical threshold. So, the prosecution's claim of severe disorder wasn't just legally debatable. It was definitively, physically impossible. That brings us to Part 3, Jurisprudence, focusing on legal and logical voids. If physics proves a system-wide effect was completely impossible, let's look at the legal logic that justified this charge in the first place. This exposes a really profound logical void right at the heart of the indictment. The prosecution basically weaponized his PhD. They assumed that his high education meant he maliciously knew these posts were dangerous, framing him as this sort of mastermind. But Dr. Chen flipped the script entirely. He argued that his education actually proved he knew exactly how harmless he was. Because he understood complex systems and network dynamics, he possessed the scientific certainty that his actions were essentially dropping a pebble into an empty ocean. He knew he couldn't cause a riot. Therefore, he fundamentally had zero malicious intent to cause one. Plus, this highlights a massive misapplication of the rules. The prosecution was confusing internal political party discipline with national criminal law. They were imposing highly subjective identity labels instead of relying on hard objective evidence. Think about how wild that is for a second. It's kind of like judging a regular citizen by the rulebook of a private club that they never even joined. If an organization has internal rules for its members about what they can say, well, that's one thing. But applying those internal disciplinary standards to an independent, non-party scholar under the guise of a national criminal statute, that is a total breakdown of legal boundaries. So the crucial point on the legal front is this. Serious public disorder actually requires observable reality and physical evidence, not just virtual assumptions. Just think about it. If the original posts were still sitting online a year later, completely untouched, and no servers crashed, and literally no one panicked in the streets, well, where exactly is the crime scene? Because the retweets generated zero real-world impact, the legal requirement for serious disorder was a completely false proposition. It was an illusion with zero physical evidence existing entirely in the minds of the prosecutors.
Okay, Part 4. Cognition and System Collision. Let's pivot and explore the cognitive psychology behind this dialogue failure. It's a fascinating look at a clash between two fundamentally different information processing systems.
The judicial authorities were leaning heavily on schema-driven processing, meaning they were using rigid mental shortcuts. You know, in an overloaded bureaucracy, people rely on heuristics. They saw a label like PhD combined with political retweets, their brains activated an automated threat response, and they essentially just stopped thinking. Dr. Chen, meanwhile, was utilizing System 2 thinking. He was operating with a highly complex, analytical, scientific mind, carefully parsing out the data, the thresholds, and the network logic. They weren't just disagreeing on the facts, they were literally operating on completely incompatible cognitive software.
It's honestly a textbook case of confirmation bias blinding one side to reality. The authorities were solely seeking proof for their preset assumptions about threats, completely ignoring the blatant, objective reality of his zero-follower count. Meanwhile, Dr. Chen was using hypothesis testing. He treated all incoming information, including the very charges against him, as variables in a theory that had to be tested against empirical evidence. He looked for the data. The bureaucratic system basically saw a nail that urgently needed to be hammered. The scholar saw a complex equation that needed to be balanced objectively. Finally, we arrive at Part 5, Humanism and Spiritual Breakout. Humanistic psychology actually gives us the why behind Dr. Chen choosing to write a staggering 20,000-word defense instead of just submitting for a lighter sentence. I mean, why go through all that effort when the system isn't even speaking your language?
Well, by completely inverting Maslow's hierarchy of needs, his defense became a raw psychological survival mechanism. Normally, right, a person in custody is absolutely terrified. They prioritize basic safety above all else, often doing whatever it takes, even offering a false confession just to improve their physical situation and maybe get a lighter sentence. That is just human nature. But Dr. Chen, he jumped straight to the very top of the pyramid. He prioritized self-actualization, defending pure logic and objective truth over his own immediate physical comfort and freedom. It's an incredibly rare and profound choice to make when you're in such an incredibly vulnerable position.
So the real takeaway here is that this wasn't just about winning a legal argument. It was about protecting his basic human dignity against a system that actively tried to reduce him to a mere data point. By refusing dehumanization, his massive 20,000-word defense preserved his self-congruence and intellectual integrity. He simply refused to be alienated from his own reality. Just ask yourself, what would you do if a massive, powerful system demanded you confess to something that openly defied the basic laws of physics? Would you fold? Dr. Chen didn't. He used his intellect to prove he was still a functioning, autonomous human being. We'll wrap up this explainer with this profound thought. While authority can dictate the rules, it can never rewrite the objective laws of physics and mathematics. Dr. Chen's defense really leaves us to ponder. What exactly does it mean for a society when its legal code collides head-on with the unyielding laws of the universe? It's a truly fascinating look at the limits of power and the absolute invincibility of science. Thanks so much for diving into this explainer with me, and definitely keep questioning the systems around you.